So again, welcome back to Friday PSAs. This is the recording of our show on October 4th, 2024. Starting this weekend, we mark 1 year since the more than 75-year occupation of Palestine accelerated into this latest iteration of bitter colonial violence, a barbaric genocide of historical proportions. Gaza is now decimated, and as we've said on this program before, the humanitarian crises facing Palestinians, starvation and disease, lack of food and housing, can add thousands more to what we already know is an underreported death toll. The UN's biweekly humanitarian situation reports on Gaza are a grim documentation of these challenges, and they include likely incomplete information on the daily bombings by Israeli forces that kill children and families whose names never make it to our news feeds. So, what does it mean for us to mark this historical milestone in Gaza while it's still underway? While we find ourselves on a war footing in Lebanon, um, which is now a new front for invasion and colonial expansion. And while Israel threatens to initiate a war with Iran, that may escalate into a regional or even global nuclear conflict. So, how do we push forward as Palestinian activism is being repressed and criminalized in the streets, in classrooms, and in the halls of our elected governments? How do we grieve and commemorate this incalculable human loss together? This week, there will be a slate of actions and interventions for community members to join that will provide spaces to engage with those questions directly. And I'm going to spend my time in this introduction just to highlight a few before we get into the news and analysis. But I want to encourage everyone, as Samra always does, to check out the AROC event calendar if you're in the Bay Area, which is full of actions this week, both direct actions and other ways of plugging in, including some the fundraisers that are also happening this week. And if you're not in the Bay, I would encourage you to check out the list of actions here, which is shutitdownforpalestine.org. And I will drop that in just below what Annie has dropped into the chat. Give me a moment. I want to share my screen so you can get a sense of what's going on. I'm going to just cover a couple of these actions that are coming this week. So this is, as Iraq is framing it for us, a 1 year of genocide, 1 year of Samud, and it is an all-out for Palestine week of action starting October 6th through the 13th. It will be bookended by two fundraisers. One is the benefit concert for Gaza that's happening tomorrow on Saturday, October 5th. Which is happening at the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California in Oakland. And there's a link there for you to get tickets. And it is being co-sponsored by PYM, Palestinian Youth Movement, and Mecca. And it is a benefit for Mecca, Middle East Children's Alliance. It is going to be this week of action will be bookended with next Saturday's Iraq fundraiser for Gaza, which is happening in San Francisco at the African American Arts and Culture Complex. And we encourage you to put both of these events on your calendar and consider joining. The fundraiser will also be a benefit for Mecca's efforts in Gaza. The week will also include some important direct actions and opportunities to plug into urgent campaigns that are part of broader Palestine solidarity work. The big action is Sunday, October 6th at 1 p.m. in San Francisco, at 16th and Valencia, and that will be a mass demonstration. And we encourage folks that can to please come out and join the free art build on tomorrow, Saturday, October 5th, between 12 and 3 p.m. at Reams to help folks prepare what we need for the demonstration that's happening on Sunday. And just a note that there will be a crew of amazing artists who will be there, who will be collaborating to just do screen printing and poster making at Reams. So encourage you all to join that. There will also be a student walkout on October 8th. Students for Justice in Palestine, Bears for Palestine, Law Students for Justice in Palestine, and Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine, in addition to the Muslim Students Association and JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, are all working together with students across the nation in solidarity with Palestinians and Lebanese communities facing Zionist violence to call for a walkout at UC Berkeley. And so if you're an alum or student, that's something to keep an eye out for and see what calls for support are coming for that action on Tuesday. CPE is also hosting a couple of events next week, just political education events. There will be this event on Thursday at Eastside Arts Alliance with Helena Koban, Rami Khoury, and Nora Bowers Friedman talking about Palestinian resistance from the PLO to Hamas and the book launch of Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. And there'll be another similar event with Helena and Rami with Professor Omar Azaza from SF State, which will be at the Eric Casada Center at 518 Valencia on Sunday, the following Sunday after this one. And finally, in terms of some major actions, that same Sunday at 1:30 in Oakland, there'll be the Samud Mural Community Launch. I've seen some of the images, and we know many of the artists. It's a absolutely magnificent mural and a deep commemoration of Palestinian and Arab resilience and solidarity. And so I encourage everyone that can to take a look at that flyer and consider joining it and taking a look at the mural, which will be at Uptown Auto Body in Oakland. Okay, so that is, and just one other reminder, again, like we're on Spotify now, so if you have folks that can't join the PSAs and, aren't going to be able to watch them on YouTube, consider having them take a listen on Spotify. Okay, with that, I am going to bring up Samra. Samra, thanks for bearing with me. A lot of actions this week, so wanted to make sure that folks were made aware of them, but we have a lot to cover, and so I'm going to just turn it over to you to give us the latest on what's happening, both with regard to Hezbollah repelling the invasion into Lebanon, and then also with regard to what's happening in Gaza, and of course with the war with Iran.
Thanks, Thomas. It's great to be here. I know every week we say there's so much, and then every week we comment that that week in particular is a lot, and I'm going to do that again. It's been such a week. I really don't know how we're going to get through all the different things, but I will do my best. Please bear with me. Obviously, as we're coming close to the 1 year anniversary of Israel's assault on Gaza, which, started, I believe, on the 13th. So we're just over a week away from that inauspicious day. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about Gaza, though I did want to focus the majority of the time both on what's happening in Lebanon and some prospects for what we know in terms of the Israel-Iran fight that seems to be brewing and escalating. So I did, however, at least want to give the time that is due for what is happening in Gaza because it has been a particularly bloody week there. The death toll has gone up by, I think, at least 300 or so, the official death toll. There was a series of really intense airstrikes and ground offensives for a few reasons that we'll get into in short order. As I was pulling together information for this week, I pulled this Reuters article on the 30th about how ground fighting seems to have gone down, despite the fact that airstrikes are continuing. And then you can see this article just 3 days later showing the exact opposite dynamic where, a large ground-based tank offensive was sent in across southern Gaza, but particularly in Khan Yunis. There's a few reasons for this change in dynamics. Of course, there's a sort of regular ebb and flow of Israel's colonial violence in Gaza, but also one is after the Iran attacks, where, in very typical form, Israel does these sort of retributive strikes against vulnerable populations as a way of, getting back at people who they feel have harmed them. But there was also a pretty significant insurgent action in Khan Yunis by the armed wing of Hamas, the Qassam brigades that resulted in a series of IDF casualties. So I think those two things combined along with sort of, the general Israeli dispositional attitude towards Gaza, has led to a series of really intense strikes this week that largely went unnoticed. It should go, um, it should be mentioned given the amount of tension that has been paid to Iran and Lebanon this week. So those airstrikes were all over Gaza, but largely took place in Khan Yunis. That's also where a lot of the ground offensive and artillery strikes were. One of the airstrikes was on an orphanage, the Al Amal Institute for Orphans, which was also housing IDPs, of course. But the range and the brutality of these strikes was really something. And of course, a series of targets on journalists, including Wafa Ali Al-Udaini, who is an English-speaking reporter who often covers Gaza for Western press, has a very large social media following in English. So that direct attack on her is the sort of latest in a long line of Israel's assassination of journalists across the Gaza Strip. I also wanted to just take a moment um, to encourage you all to read this 972 article on what's been happening for folks in Gaza with disabilities and ways that the ongoing genocide has obviously impacted more vulnerable populations in ways that often goes unnoticed and unmentioned. Um, and another really wide-ranging round of school strikes across the Strip, including several up in Gaza City. These are not only schools that are sheltering internally displaced people, but also sometimes just schools operating as schools. Uh, a series of UNRWA-run schools were also struck again this week, leading to a very high number of children casualties. And it's not just the Gaza Strip. There were a series of really intense airstrikes in the West Bank as well, including a gigantic strike in Tulkaram, where uh, I believe the largest aerial strike since the Intifada at least took place, resulting in, I think, a couple dozen people dying. I know this article says 18, but I think that number has gone up since then. So this ostensibly to attack a Hamas leader that was in that camp, but of course, the large scale and the choice of large scale ordnance, again, in a refugee camp where Israel has shown its ability to do targeted assassinations is clearly a sort of deliberate attempt to inflict large scale casualties there. The other West Bank news that I did want to touch on quickly was just this new round of U.S. sanctions against West Bank settler groups. This is the so-called Hilltop Youth Group, which sounds so benign. Um, there isn't a whole lot to say about this. It's a little bit related to the previous round of U.S. sanctions against a IDF military group that was largely recruiting from this settler group, Hilltop Youth. That group is specifically and openly backed by Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister. So these sanctions mean basically nothing. The the those settlers, the Hilltop Youth folks, have previously mentioned to the Associated Press, for example, that these sanctions don't actually meaningfully impact them. And as we've seen previously this year, when the U.S. levies sanctions like this, it also often reaches out to the Israeli government and says, we are trying to block U.S. assets from going to those people, but we have no problem with you giving assets to those people. So it's like a, performative at best sort of attempt to demonstrate some sort of mild disapproval in a moment where otherwise, that the meaningful response to that sort of settler violence in the West Bank continues to go largely unaccountable. So that was my somewhat quick Gaza update. We'll loop around to some of the bigger Gaza themes shortly, but I did want to take some time to talk about, of course, all the things that are happening in Lebanon, and there are many. If folks attended the PSA last week, we closed it with a news story about a very large airstrike where Israel said that it was possible that that strike had led to the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. And sure enough, we found out, I think, a few hours afterwards that that it had, in fact, assassinated Nasrallah in this massive bombing campaign of a really dense apartment block that I think upwards of 300 people. And I wanted to just quickly reflect on how far the US has fallen in terms of what it considers to be acceptable behavior by Israel, by juxtaposing these two, like on the left, the statement from Joe Biden about the death of Nasrallah, where he calls the airstrike a measure of justice. Nasrallah aside, just the fact that, that it led to the murder of around 300 people, versus this article from 20 years ago, under President George Bush, of all people, denouncing an attack from Israel that killed one of the founders and the military head of Hamas at the time, because that airstrike killed 14 other people, including some children. So, just the extent to which the Biden administration doesn't even uphold the sort of standard of conduct that the George W. Bush administration held in terms of what was responsible collateral damage in these sorts of strikes, I think is really, really telling about both the sort of way that discourse in the United States has devolved generally, but also specifically around how the Biden administration and Biden as a singular individual has so wholeheartedly embraced this sort of Zionist position that, basically there are no number of Arab lives that are too high to be killed. There's a lot of interesting stuff swirling around the assassination itself. This really remarkable tidbit from NBC, of all places, that I hadn't actually seen anywhere else, uh, quoted some Israeli officials that said that they made the decision to conduct the assassination specifically because during the ceasefire negotiations that were happening with Hezbollah, Nasrallah himself made it extremely clear that there would never be a separation between Lebanon and Gaza. Basically, the only way to get a ceasefire in Lebanon would be to get a ceasefire in Gaza, which is the thing that Hezbollah has been saying from day one, which is this is a support front. We don't want this to become the main theater of conflict. The point of these attacks is to draw resources and to, provide breathing room for their allied resistance axis partners in Gaza, and to keep the focus on Gaza. So the idea being that, Nasrallah will continue firing until Israel made a deal with Hamas. And so that was just, that was the thing that led them to sort of make this final decision to carry out that assassination. Whether that's true or not, it's a little bit hard to know. And then similarly, in a very opposite vein, the foreign minister of Lebanon actually claimed that Nasrallah had already agreed to the ceasefire right before Israel assassinated him. That's also a sort of unverifiable thing, although he claims that that ceasefire agreement was made in conjunction with the Speaker of the House, Nebi Berri, and that it was already communicated to the US and France, and that the US had responded that that Israel had also agreed to that ceasefire. So both of these interpretations are really unhinged. I'm frankly a lot more inclined towards the one on the left than the one on the right. I think that the Lebanese government, for very obvious reasons, wants to see a ceasefire implemented basically immediately and basically under any terms, given that the Lebanese army isn't actually involved in the fighting at all and would like for it to stop. So I would give that Abdullah Abu Habib's interpretation of things with a grain of salt, but I don't know. It's hard to know. In terms of the invasion itself, obviously we've seen a huge bombing campaign this past week, the deadliest in Lebanon, as we talked about last week, the deadliest in Lebanon, since the Civil War, right? Not even since the Israeli assault in 2006. But I would say, despite the fact that Israeli ground troops have moved into Lebanon, um, I would say that the invasion has not, in fact, started. What we did see was a series of skirmishes around the border, what Israel called a limited operation, meaning they just sent a very small group, I think a single battalion or less, across the border to conduct some small exercises and then left. So there may well be some Israeli troops in Lebanese territory right now, and there may well not be, actually. So I do think that at this point, that sort of invasion is more or less a bygone conclusion. I think it's very, very likely that it will happen. If folks remember last week, we were saying it didn't seem quite clear whether it would definitely play out. in that particular way, on whether this was more of like a PR sort of move. It does feel very much like it is playing out that way. Um, it's there's a lot about I think what's going to happen here with the invasion, and I'll loop back around to that in a minute. But before I get to that, I did want to touch on the ways in which U.S. support for this escalation has actually been happening in a really explicit way behind the scenes. This bombshell Politico report that I would really recommend that you read if you haven't seen it yet, about how particular officials within the Biden administration have been openly telling the Israelis that this sort of escalation is actually a good thing. And there's a few quotes that I pulled out of this uh, that I think really demonstrate this idea that like um, they're hoping for a sort of new Middle East, you know? And the figures behind this are friends of the friends of the PSA. Amos Hochstein, who we've talked about several times previously, the person whose specific job within the Biden administration right now is supposed to be de-escalating the conflict between Israel and Lebanon, has apparently been one of the people who has secretly been pushing the escalation, which if folks were here for the deep dive we did on Amos Hochstein several months ago will not actually come as a surprise. Along with Brett McGurk, who a very long time advisor on the Middle East for the past four presidential administrations, should give you a sense of just how astute Brett McGurk is and his ability to implement his long-standing vision of a new Middle East. The question that I feel like remains unanswered by this Politico article, and I think will probably come into a little bit more focus in the coming months, maybe, is why and how these two particular people were pursuing this particular tack, given that the sort of public Biden administration perspective has been one of de-escalation, right? Like at every opportunity, Biden and his proxies have been very keen to say things along the lines of, we don't want this to escalate into a regional war. We don't want this to escalate into a regional war. Um, we back Israel, but we are concerned about the sort of escalatory nature of the conflict. That's the exact opposite of what these two people have been saying to the Israeli officials directly. So, I think the explanation for that falls somewhere along a spectrum here, right? The most generous interpretation is that Biden has no control over his own administration, and that, like, hawks within the sort of broader Zionist Biden administration take are uh, pulling administration policy towards confrontation, despite the desire for the rest of the administration to not have that. It's a conceivable interpretation. I think there are a lot of folks in there that do feel like the better way to support Israel is not to let it get caught up and entangled in all these fights. And I think the more cynical interpretation at the other end of that spectrum is that Biden wants this, right? That this is the thing that the administration actually wants. The broad escalation across these fronts that allow for, the enemies of United States security policy, Hamas, Hezbollah, Yemen, the militias in Iraq, the Syrians and the Iranians, a sort of like wipe clean slate that allows the U.S. to reestablish its hegemony in the region. That's a very conceivable interpretation, I think. And I think the reality is probably somewhere in between those two things. But regardless, it's now clearer than it has ever been why Biden, despite all of his calls for de-escalation, has not actually successfully de-escalated anything, right? It's partly because he's being undermined, possibly, and it's partly because all of that was just for show. Because, even the Biden administration, I think, is well aware of how unpopular that position is with the U.S. voting public. So, yeah, again, read this article if you have not yet. That support also is extending into, of course, air support and ground support from the U.S. government. So, troop deployments and a series of sort of aerial satellite support and radar support and a series of other things. The small bit of good news on this front is that even though there have been several more articles this week about troop deployments to the Middle East, there actually haven't been any. I mean, there are troops that are deploying to the Middle East this week, but they are just sort of like the general typical military rotations. So these like the deployments that have been scheduled for I don't know how long, many, many months, if not years, and they're just swapping out the people who are on the ground now for other people. So that itself is not an inherently escalatory thing. The only meaningful troop deployment that has happened is the one that we talked about last week, which was the Air Force deployment, which again is a very troubling sign. So that was a very bad indication that happened last week of increased escalations. That hasn't continued into this week, which is good. So now, given what we understand about where the U.S. is positioned in terms of how it supports this Israeli offensive and invasion, the sort of like material conditions on the ground for what Israel feels like it's capable of doing. We talked last week about the troops and sort of force capability that Israel is able to bring to its northern border. The question I think now is what's going to happen, right? What is this invasion going to look like if this invasion does in fact really begin in a like deeper fashion than what we've seen so far, which despite the fact that it's been a horrific week of sort of unimaginable violence across Lebanon, we're still not, believe it or not, in invasion territory yet. We might be by tonight. I think it wouldn't be surprising if it happened in the next day or so, but we are not there yet. Um, I I think a giant question mark around this is where is Hezbollah at, right? What is the capability of Hezbollah as a deterrent force for this Israeli invasion in this moment? And it's hard to say, right? There's absolutely no question that Hezbollah took some huge hits in these past few weeks. Between the pager attack, the assassination not just of Nasrallah, but of most or a large chunk of the senior commanders means that they're definitely in nowhere near the position that they were in several weeks ago. The question then, I think, becomes, are they materially situated to repel an Israeli invasion in spite of those losses? And it's a little bit hard to say, but I would say that preliminary indications from, Israel's first little forays across the Lebanese border really do indicate that if this invasion goes forward full throttle, it's going to be rough. It's going to be really, really rough. And you do have to consider the fact that we are talking about a fighting force that numbers in the six figures that have been training for decades, battle hardened through a series of other direct hot war conflicts in very mountainous terrain where the Israelis can't really use like tanks or large equipment in that sort of way. Um, in a fashion that the existing Hezbollah military capabilities were designed to be very decentralized and very localized in the like in case they found themselves in a situation with low communication capabilities. So I my like take in this moment is an Israeli invasion into Lebanon is going to be a disaster for Israel, an absolute disaster for Israel. And folks who have been attending these PSAs for a while maybe remember some of the conversations we've had around some of these questions earlier about like, okay, every international assessment, like every US military assessment, the Israeli military assessments of a Israeli invasion into Lebanon were that it would be a disaster. And the fact that they were doing it anyway made us sort of ask like, okay, well, what do they know that we don't know? Right? Like what makes the Israeli military feel confident that it can conduct this sort of offensive against Lebanon, given the fact that all of these analyses said that it was going to be impossible? And I think we have a little more clarity on that than we did a few weeks ago, right? Now we know what they knew in terms of, they had compromised Hezbollah's communication system. They've clearly deeply infiltrated the organization to be able to target these people so precisely. And they had the capability to sort of decapitate the leadership of the organization. My take, and I think the take of a lot of folks who have been studying this from a sort of military angle, is that's not enough to win a ground war, right? That's not even remotely enough to win a ground war. So the question now is, are there more things that the Israelis know that we don't know, or was this the ace that was in their sleeve? If this is all they had, then yeah, I think an invasion to the extent that it's going to happen is not going to be good. It's going to be very, very, very bad for them. But we'll find out a lot more. I have a feeling by our next PSA we'll have a lot to say about how that is or is not going. I did want to take just one moment to talk about the evacuations in Lebanon, just because the absurdity of the fact that the US government very quickly chartered flights to get people out of Israel after after the October attack of last year, whereas the broad bombardment and destruction of like infrastructure across Lebanon and the killing of 2,000 people has not, in fact, spurred the U.S. government to do the same thing for Lebanon, where they're insisting that people take commercial flights out of the country, even though they cost over $8,000. They did a similar thing when I was there in 2006, incidentally, but just goes to show where the U.S. government's priorities are vis-a-vis which citizens it cares about. So that was our quick run through of the Lebanon stuff. In terms of the Iran attack, oh, there's so much to say here. We know that, like Iran launched this large-scale ballistic missile attack on the 1st of October. It's pretty clear why they did it, given the attacks on all of Iran's allies across the region, particularly in Hezbollah. Given that Iran is a sort of sponsor of all of these groups, it can't do nothing, right? It has to be seen to have some sort of ability to protect and respond to attacks on its proxies across the region. So this sort of action was on some level inevitable. The question was just the extent to which this Iran attack was going to take place. Was it going to be a sort of opening of a hot war front, right? It's very conceivable, and we did touch on this a little bit last week, that Iran might feel like without Hezbollah's ability to sort of project power into Israel, that Israel might feel more emboldened to attack Iran directly. And if Iran felt like those attacks were now inevitable, it may as well strike first. That's one possibility. The other end of possibility is just that Iran is still trying to avoid the regional escalation, right? Like Iran really doesn't want to be in a hot war with Israel. It's very, very, very clear. And neither does Hezbollah um, um, for that matter, given that even after these giant assaults, we are continuing to see Hezbollah stick to the same existing pattern of attacks that it had before this bombing campaign, right? So it's still launching missiles into the north. It sent one ballistic missile down to Tel Aviv. And, when interviewed, a series of Hezbollah spokespeople said, we're sticking to the script. Like we have a plan and we're sticking to that plan. And that plan is to not escalate. It's to just maintain the sort of war of attrition across the border. And it does seem that that's what Iran was trying to do here. If we sort of, now that we can look at the aftermath of this attack, a way to demonstrate the way I referred to it with some friends was performative deterrence, and not performative in the sense that it doesn't mean anything, but to act out this idea of deterrence that, okay, when you attack our allies, this is what can happen. And the fact that those ballistic missiles actually made it through Israel's air defense systems really does say a lot in terms of saying that they are capable of making these meaningful attacks. The fact that they very clearly purposely avoided civilian infrastructure and civilian impacts, the only things that were hit were a airfield and the area around the Mossad, tells you, I think, among other things, that Iran is trying to give Israel an out here, right? It's an attack that both demonstrates capability and can be dismissed by the Israeli government as oh, look, they weren't able to successfully hurt any of us. Although I'd say that I don't think they were trying to hurt anybody. And that was sort of the point, that it was an opportunity to de-escalate, to be like, okay, you attacked, we attacked, now we're done. That's obviously not what's going to happen, but it is an attempt, I think, to sort of turn down the temperature rather than turn it up. We don't know much about the actual impact of that Iranian missile attack, and I would say that it doesn't super duper matter anyway, probably. They're claiming that 90% of their missiles hit their targets. That seems like a little bit of a stretch to me, but we don't know the extent of the damage because, and I highlighted this on the article on the left here, information on impacts and damage are barred from publication in Israel, right? There is an IDF censor that actually goes through the media and prevents you from reporting anything about damage that other people inflict onto the Israeli state. So it's really hard to know. On the right is a Washington Post article that just came out, I think a couple hours ago, showing that they did some pretty extensive damage to that airfield, the Nevatim Air Force Base, where I believe U.S. resupply aerial resupplies actually come into this base. So I think they picked that spot for a reason. Um, the wildest moment of that attack, for me at least, I mean, this may not be true, but maybe the most ironic was, of course, the CNN anchor talking about how uh, it was really in like it was deeply immoral for Iran to fire these ballistic missiles at the Mossad headquarters because the Mossad headquarters are in a densely populated civilian area. And so it's an incredible, like, you know, the way that the Western media wants to have it both ways, right? Where like if Israel attacked an area that was in a densely populated civilian like location, they would call that human shields. But when somebody else attacks Israel, an Israeli target in a densely populated civilian area, well, that's just called endangering civilians. You know, like you can't have it either way. The other remarkably wild thing that happened that day was that that was the date of the Iran attack was the date that Anthony Blinken chose to publish his op-ed in Foreign Affairs about America's strategy of renewal, just to show the extent to which Tony Blinken is a total failure in everything that he does. Showing that like, oh yeah, like look at all that we're doing to bring stability to the world is literally published the day that Iran launches a missile attack on Israel. Some other fallout from that is just, you know, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has now been declared persona non grata in Iran, meaning that he's not allowed to travel in Israel. I'm sorry, meaning that he's not allowed to travel to Israel anymore because he called for a ceasefire after the Iran attack, as opposed to sort of like expressing sympathy for Israel. Um, and of course, I'd say the big thing is that Israel has made it very clear that they're planning some sort of really big payback. What that's going to be is really hard to know, but whatever it is, it's going to be very, very bad. I think we can definitively say that it's going to be very bad. I think we're likely to see something in the next week or two. There's been a lot of talk about targeting Iran's oil and energy infrastructure, which of course is a war crime. The US government has refused to say anything about denouncing an attack on civilian infrastructure, but it is worth noting that Iran has said very plainly that if its oil fields are hit, or its refineries or any part of its energy infrastructure, that it will do the same to Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, Kuwait, the UAE, and Bahrain. So, as you know, you can see the Gulf states are definitely sort of freaking out and declaring neutrality in this conflict, which is, you know, for the Gulf states to say that they're neutral vis-a-vis Iran is a pretty big development, but is largely from the idea that they're terrified that this Israeli strike could lead to basically the global collapse of energy infrastructure. And, you know, not for nothing, obviously, this would be just a couple weeks before the election and would have massive economic implications across the planet if something like that actually happens. So would the Biden administration let that happen? Probably at this point. I would have, you know, if you had asked me that a year ago, I would have said absolutely not. That would be, you know, political suicide, but seems like they don't care. That impunity has also extended to the way that Israel has struck Syria. I feel like, you know, I rarely talk about what's been happening in Syria, and I probably should be. Often when Israel is striking Lebanon, it's also striking Syria. We just don't hear about it in Western news. It really hit a fever pitch yesterday when Israel basically struck a Russian airbase. They didn't hit it exactly, but they hit around it in a way that has now led Russia to tell all of Russian citizens to evacuate Israel. There's more here, and it's likely that that base itself wasn't hit, but in the interest of time, I'll leave you to read those articles yourself. And then just zooming back out a little bit, a couple of things happening on like the Israel domestic front. You know, we spoke a few weeks ago on the PSA about the possibility that Netanyahu was going to replace Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, with Gideon Sa'ar, who is like a person with no combat experience. That is not what ended up happening. That person has now joined the cabinet, but with no position. So he's just sort of like a floating cabinet member. What that means, we don't super duper know yet. There may still be a plan in the works to replace Yoav Gallant. There very much seems to be a plan for Sa'ar and Netanyahu to replace the head of the army. These are sort of like very nakedly political moves to shore up Netanyahu's support right now. and also maybe to buy him a bit of breathing room away from the super hard right folks that are really dominating the coalition right now. But this sort of like hawkish right-wing Israeli with no military experience who seems to sort of like want to lead Israel's military capabilities will be an interesting development. Let's just leave it at that. I also wanted to point people to this quite remarkable article in Responsible Statecraft that basically asked uh, a bunch of analysts what they think is going to happen with U.S.-Israeli relations after everything that happened this past year. It's fascinating. And the range of responses are also really interesting. So give that a read if you find yourself with the time. Last week, we also mentioned that Moody's was going to cut Israel's credit rating, and it did that same day. But what we did not know at the time was that they cut it by 2 points instead of just one. So Israel's credit rating has now been downgraded, I think, 3 levels since the beginning of the war. If it is downgraded another 3 levels, it reaches junk bond status, right? Like basically the lowest possible rating that you can get to. And soon after that, S&P also cut Israel's credit rating. So like these economic impacts are clearly compounding at this point. Just very briefly wanted to mention that the Maldives has now joined, I think, 7 other countries in South Africa's genocide case at the ICJ. It's like Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Turkey, Spain, Palestine, I think, and something else I'm missing. So the Maldives submission is available on the ICJ website if folks want to read it. A group of 99 healthcare workers sent a very difficult to read but extremely powerful letter to Biden and Harris about what's been happening in Gaza and demanding an arms embargo. I definitely recommend giving that a read and uplifting it a little bit. They're demanding a meeting, and I think it's a good tack for pressure. One of the things they note in there, and this is similar to the previous letter that they had sent, I think in May, is they sort of look at mortality rates and try to sort of napkin out a conservative estimate of the actual death toll as opposed to sort of, the health ministry's confirmed death toll. Like, what do we think the total number of people, both who we can identify and who we can't identify is? And their conservative estimate is 120,000. Which is over 5% of the population of Gaza at this point. It's a very difficult letter to read, but I do recommend folks do it. Just a minute on the US election to say that for the first time in a generation, Arab Americans now favor Republicans over Democrats, according to the Arab American Institute. You can see the flip happening here in October of 2023, and then the support for Democrats shooting back up to almost its pre-October level. And this number where the 238s meet is when Biden dropped out of the race, right? And there was that like moment of a lot of hope. So I expect that number to start to crater again now that we're seeing what Kamala Harris is saying around a lot of this Gaza stuff. It's particularly stark, I think, in Michigan, where there was a leaked internal Democratic poll showing that the Democratic Party considers Michigan to be underwater right now, that Republicans are looking likely to win Michigan in the presidential election. And a big part of that is not just Arab voters, but Black and Arab voters who are like abandoning the Harris administration in pretty high numbers. This polling information I was just flabbergasted by. This is from the New York Times, showing that for the 18 to 29 age bracket, Donald Trump is up by 1%. The same New York Times poll, this is in Michigan, sorry. The same New York Times poll in August, so just 1 month prior to this poll, had Harris up in that same demographic 51 to 36. So she was up by 15% among the youth vote, and she's now down by 1%. There could be some like polling noise here, but I think a very reasonable explanation for that is obviously young folks are being turned off by the fact that they were hoping that Harris would have a different tack on the genocide, and she hasn't. In California, 3 really horrific bills just signed by Governor Newsom, basically all about reducing Palestine solidarity. I won't get into the details on these, but I would definitely recommend that you sign the petitions for this and um, yeah, read up and share a little bit about the damage from those bills. In a broader sort of look at repression, this really, really strong article from In These Times, I think is also definitely worth a read about how Jewish institutions in the United States are like doing these litmus tests for Israel support and firing staff who aren't sufficiently pro-Israel. But the real repression thing that I wanted to focus on today is just this anti-Semitism workshop that I meant to talk about last week and forgot. My apologies. Where the American Jewish Committee, which is like it calls itself an Israel advocacy organization, has been contracted by the city to conduct anti-Semitism workshops in San Francisco Unified School District, despite the fact that the teachers union and like ethnic studies folks and folks who specialize in like anti-racism and anti-Semitism curricula were like, this is the wrong choice. We should have anti-Semitism workshops, but they should be conducted by people who actually do real anti-Semitism work, not Israel lobbying organizations. There was enough pressure that the original workshop got canceled, and it seems that it has now been rescheduled because London Breed is really, really keen on making this workshop happen. Just to give like a quick sense of how how abhorrent this is. Not only is the AJC speaking out very like happily and proudly about the bombing of Lebanon right now, like they're talking about the successful strikes on Lebanon, which is an insane thing for a purported civil rights organization to say. The content that they have on anti-Semitism is itself pretty unhinged. Like there's something in here about um, guidance for high schools about how to deal with like the sort of anniversary of the October 7th attacks. And one of the things that they note is that you shouldn't even mention Palestinian deaths. That it's like inappropriate to talk about the fact that Palestinians have also died. So just to give you a sense of where the AJC sits in terms of its positionality. There is a petition active right now to get people to get the city of San Francisco to cancel this training. It is already at 10,000 signatures, which is great. So I definitely signed it. And then just to sum up, we did see Gaza bear a lot of the brunt of Israeli punitive strikes this week, partly as a response to the Iran attacks, and partly because, again, it's attempts to sort of militarily defeat Hamas are failing. The invasion of Lebanon hasn't started, but it is probably about to. I think we're on the cusp of seeing it, and I think that we are about to see Hezbollah's capability to deter it very, very soon. I mean, we've already started to see it. I think we have a better sense of what Israel thinks it can accomplish in Lebanon, and I think, assuming that there are no more big surprises, that their analysis is deeply, deeply flawed. But of course, there may be more surprises. Israel's desire to escalate with Iran will lead to something very bad in the coming week or so. I think it's very likely that there's going to be some really bad strike, and like the hope here is that it does not lead to the regional escalation that all of us are trying to avoid. And the U.S. has been secretly backing that escalation. So we are in this like final stretch campaign season. These are like the moments where the U.S. machine is sort of uniquely vulnerable. So pressure on every front is absolutely critical. So even things like that AJC petition, I think, demonstrate a sort of changing public perception that may have to force the U.S.'s hand in some ways or another. These levers aren't good levers, but they're the levers we've got. Wanted to remind folks about some of the upcoming events that Thomas mentioned right at the top, including the big protest on Sunday. Hope to see you there. As always, check out the calendar. Text PSA to 833-633-0604 for text updates, and check out the Palestine Media Tracker if you want access to the articles that inform this analysis. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Sammer. And before we bring Melissa up to close this out, just one note is that to your last point about the U.S. Sort of secretly behind the scenes pushing for this escalation, even with regards to Iran, I think it's probably clear that in order to actually fully demobilize their nuclear facilities, they're probably going to need U.S. support there as well. And so I think that no matter what the Biden administration is saying publicly, um, the U.S. is has got a lot of culpability here about the potential for an escalated regional conflict, which, to your point about the energy supplies, would have a global impact almost immediately if Iran and Israel go back and forth in terms of attacking energy infrastructure. I'm also surprised you didn't mention the Bret Stephens article.
I I had it in there and I removed it. You don't need bed bug analysis on